forward it here. Yes, especially to be friendlier towards our participants in difficult time zones. I think we should start now, and then if anybody else join us later, that's perfectly fine as well. I hope you all can hear me. Welcome everyone to the 21st Virtual Roundtable on Measuring Corruption. I'm very excited to continue seeing well, not all faces, but recurrent faces. I'm very excited about that. Also, some people that have presented in previous roundtables, such as Robert, who is joining us here at 5 a.m. In his time zone. So I'm very grateful for that. And also a lot of new faces. So that tells me that there continues to be a lot of interest in the topic of measuring corruption. I don't know if we're just enjoying the connection from the IACA meeting that happened a few weeks ago, but I'm still grateful for it. I won't take much more of your time before I introduce Mattias, who will introduce himself and also start his presentation. Before that, just some basic details about how the session is gonna take place. As usual, the meeting will last 90 minutes. In the invitation in the call, it was described as 45 minutes presentation, followed by a 45 minutes question and answer and open floor. In reality, what we do is we encourage questions and comments throughout the presentation. In our experience, it makes for a more dynamic conversation throughout the entire 90 minutes. So if you have anything that you would like to know more about, or you have something to share about anything that is being presented at that moment, please feel free to raise your hand, even in the video or with the emoji, and I will invite you to unmute yourself and ask the question or comment. Also, if you write it in the chat, I will ask it for you, or I will read it out loud. Okay. Other than that, please let me remind everyone to keep your microphones muted during the presentation. And if you go out and come back in, also make sure that by the time you come back in, that your microphone is muted, because we sometimes have problems with that. Right. And one last thing, whenever you ask a question or make a comment, especially, the first time, if you could say a couple of things about yourself, so as a very brief self-introduction, your affiliation, your area of expertise, or what brings you to this meeting today. That would be grateful, because one of the objectives of these roundtables is also to encourage a connection between members of the community, especially that are interested in the topic of measuring corruption. All right. So that's it from me. I'm gonna be your host for the rest of the session. I'm Joseph Alvarez, professor at Osaka University in Japan. I'm delighted to have Dr. Mattias Agerberg with us, who is a professor at University of Gothenburg. And I will just invite him to take over from me here. And Mattias, the floor is yours.
All right. Let's see if I can share my screen here. Okay, so I assume that you can see my presentation now? Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, so first of all, thank you, Joseph, for inviting me. Really excited to see so many different people here, different organizations and backgrounds and parts of the world. So that's really exciting. And like Joseph said, like if you have any questions during my talk, just tell Joseph so he can interrupt me. So like any clarifications, or if anything's not clear, just ask, or if you want to comment on anything else. So I'm going to talk about bias in what I call citizen surveys on corruption today, and how we can understand common sources of bias, and also a bit about what we can do about these biases. So I will begin today's talk with a little bit of background, like who am I? And then some background on citizen surveys, what they are, why we do them, what kind of data we get from them, and how we can use them ideally. And then I'm going to focus specifically on two types of bias that I argue at least are quite prevalent in these types of surveys. And I'm going to present results from a study I did in Romania, where I tried to measure and test for these specific biases. And then I will talk about some implications of this and maybe like the way forward and what I think that we should think about when constructing survey measures, trying to capture citizens' view and experiences of corruption. Yes. So, who am I? I'm an associate professor of political science at the University of Gothenburg. I'm also affiliated with the Quality of Government Institute that maybe some of you have heard of. We're actually celebrating 20 years next year. It was started early 2000s by Bo Rothstein and Søren Holmberg. And we're still a very active research institute doing many different types of research, but mostly centered on questions on quality of government, corruption, and things like that in a political science framework. So my main research interests are political behavior. I work a lot on voter rationality, political representation, things like that. And then, of course, corruption. So my dissertation was on the sort of connection between corruption and political behavior and the consequences of corruption for political behavior, political participation.
Or keep him here. Okay.
And I also work a lot on quantitative methodology, so survey methodologies, survey experiments in general, and statistics and things like that. So those are my main research interests. So today's talk will be centered around this paper that I published a few years ago. It's called Corrupted Estimates, Response Bias in Citizen Surveys on Corruption. And it was published in the Political Science Journal, Political Behavior, a few years ago. I sent the paper to Joseph, so if you're interested in the actual paper, I'm sure he can send it to you. And I think it's actually open access, so you can find it online as well. So a little bit of background here. So the point of departure here is that corruption is a big problem. And it's, by now, I would say, widely recognized as maybe the main impediment to development. Well, anti-corruption is in like UN's development goals. And among researchers and experts, I think it's fair to say that there's consensus that corruption is really, really bad, and it's a really, really big impediment to development. Just to take one out of many examples here, here's the relationship between corruption and child mortality, and we see that it's a really strong relationship. So countries with high corruption have also really high child mortality, and the best performers all have low corruption, the best performance in terms of child mortality. So a really strong relationship, and we find this over and over again. So corruption is basically negatively related to everything that's positive. So if we want good outcomes, research suggests we also need low corruption. So therefore, it's of course important to understand corruption and to measure corruption so we can quantify things like this. So measuring corruption has become almost like a global industry in the past few decades. So we have like major players like Transparency International, for instance, and they get a lot of attention. They're like main corruption measure, corruption perceptions index is published every year and get a lot of media attention. But we also have a lot of other actors, World Bank, and like research institutes that like Quality of Government Institute and VDEM, and many more. So like a lot of different actors are trying to capture corruption in different ways in order to for a better understanding of the problem and test theories of corruption and remedies. So the most common measures are what I would call expert-based measures. So this is, for instance, Transparency International's CPI index. And I'm sure you all know this, but these indices are constructed based on expert assessments. And experts can be like people like me, researchers, but also practitioners and like business people. So they send around surveys, and basically the experts assess like how common is corruption in the public sector in some country on a scale from 0 to 10, things like that. And then these expert assessments are aggregated, and countries in the world are assigned a score, a corruption score. So there has been like a lot of discussion about these measures. So one common critique is that they have this sort of elite bias, because like experts tend to be elites, like high-level business people and things like that. Also like a Western bias, like many of these experts are from like Western countries, so it's not obvious that sort of researcher from the US is in the best position to assess corruption in, let's say, India or a country like that. Also, they lack transparency in, we don't like really know how experts come up with their assessments, what like data they use. We basically have to trust them, and that also makes it hard to like replicate these measures. Like we can't like really go back in the process and like reconstruct these, but because we simply don't know how different experts come up with their assessments. So citizen surveys, as I call them, they're partly a response to this. So instead of like having this top-down measure that most expert measures can be described as, we simply ask ordinary people in countries around the world. And this is like convenient because we know how to do this. Like people have run opinion surveys for decades. So it's sort of a logical extension in that sense. So it's a really simple idea. Simply ask ordinary people around the world, ideally like a random sample, ordinary people, what they think about corruption and how they view the problem and where they think it's the most common. And this has many potential advantages. We get like ground level data, ground level measures, like a bottom-up measure about the experiences of ordinary people. So we don't have this elite bias. And we also get like individual level data. So we can potentially test theories like who is the most common to be asked for a bribe. We can correlate that with individual level characteristics and things like that. So by now, like
Mattias, could I interrupt?
Sure.
Before you move on, could you go back to the previous slide? I have a question about that. Well, it both a comment and a question. I you know, when you mentioned this issue with expert-based measures, and I'm very interested also to hear more about elite bias later, if you could. But you know, your mention about transparency is very interesting. It's something that I never actually thought much about. They show with elite bias, certainly, right? Because there's always a question about, the amount of information that that expert may have available to them. If perhaps their nationality may skew their assessment of their own countries, or may put into question the amount of information they have about other countries, right? So there are always those issues. But regarding transparency, I actually never stopped to think that do we even know, for example, basic information about how many experts are consulted, what is their affiliation? I'm pretty sure that their names are never actually published or mentioned in general. Do you know if any source of corruption measurement does this? And as a second question connected to that, would it help, for example, if some of those reports were more transparent and saying, well, to score these variables related to corruption, we interviewed or we asked these experts and they provided a list. Would that help?
Yes, that's a really good question. I'm not sure about like the latest waves for the Transparency International, and I mean they certainly have this information, and I'm not sure if they publish that in their reports. The older reports that I've read more carefully, I can't remember seeing like the names of the experts, but that's definitely something they could do. And to be honest, I'm not sure like for more recent years if they do this. If we take, for instance, the VDEM Institute, they have this big democracy project where they measure democracy, but they also measure things like corruption and quality of government, and they do publish the names of the experts. You can get that information from VDEM. They also try to sort of provide confidence bounds and sort of like sort of confidence intervals around so you get sort of uncertainty measures. And they also have this this policy that you need like experts from a specific country to rate that country. So I think that's an improvement, at least in relation to the older Transparency International, like World Bank measures. But again, I'm not completely up to date with the most recent Transparency International methodologies. So I shouldn't say too much about that. But like VDEM is pretty transparent, but we still have the problem of like that we don't know exactly how the experts come up with their assessments, and that's that's impossible to know because we don't know what sources they draw on, like what type of data they use to come up with their measures. So I still think there's a big transparency problem, even if we know the identity of the experts.
Right.
Basically.
Thank you. That's great. I mean, indeed, VDEM is in many respects almost the gold standard, right? For
I would
data.
say so. When it comes to expert-based data, I
yes.
definitely.
I wasn't aware that they published the names of the experts that they consult, which I find amazing. It's very interesting to hear about. And you mentioning that, yeah, indeed, other organizations specifically focused on measuring corruption could potentially do the same, even if they aren't. Thank you. That is very informative.
Yes, sure. Okay, so like I said, citizen surveys are sort of a response to these, at least these discussions about the potential shortcomings of these expert-based measures. So by now, like many major organizations run citizen surveys where we like ask ordinary citizens, sort of conduct public opinion surveys with the ordinary citizens. So we have Global Corruption Barometer, that's from Transparency International as well. We also have Eurobarometer from the European Commission, International Crime Victim Survey, and we have from the Quality of Government Institute. They published their EQI index. That's also a citizen survey based on regions in Europe. And we also see that these types of questions that are included in these surveys are included in like the big worldwide surveys like world value survey. They include like these citizen measures of corruption. We have that in ISSP, LAPOP, and so on. So it's very, very common, these types of corruption questions that are based on these citizen surveys. And commonly used among social scientists, like to test theories in economics and political science and so on. So just as an example here, like what type of data do we get? Like, for instance, we might ask people like, to what extent they think like the following institutions are corrupt, and they get to answer on like a standard Likert scale, like agree or disagree or things like that. So we got an estimate like this share of people in, for instance, Africa. If we aggregate all of Africa, think the police is corrupt, for instance, and we can ask about a bunch of different institutions, or we can get like measures of bribery experience. So we ask people like, did you have to pay a bribe, and like which institutions were involved in this. So standard questions, I divide these into two types of questions. So either perception-based questions or experience-based questions. So one example of a perception-based question is, in your opinion, about how many politicians in Romania are involved in corruption. And you could ask this again about like how many police officers in Romania are involved in corruption, and like about the public sector, about business, everything. So here you're asking about people's perceptions, basically. The other type of question is experience-based question. So, for instance, in the past 12 months, were you at any point asked to pay a bribe to a public official? And you could make this more specific, like pay a bribe to a police officer or to a medical doctor or things like that. So these are the two main types of questions in citizen surveys. So I talked before about potential problems with these elite-based measures or expert-based measures.
Sorry.
Yes.
Second interruption of the session.
No,
Robert
it's
has a question.
I just wanted to note, the CPI, of course, is an aggregate of different sources. I'm just looking at one of them, the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index. They do disclose in their methodology report the polling companies that they used in each company, and the sample size and method, and whether it's face-to-face or online or whatever it was. So at least some of those sources do disclose something.
Yes, and I think that there has been a big improvement in recent years, and I think partly due to measures like VDEM, that they have been like really upfront about this, like that they want to be transparent, and I think that has pushed other organizations towards more transparency. So that's really good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, and just I guess to add something to that point, however, right? Because the CPI aggregates data from other sources, right? Some of those sources of data are proprietary, which means that we only see them after they have been processed into the CPI. We don't actually have access to the raw data.
Exactly. So again, there will always be problems with transparency and like reconstruction, replication, when you have many different sources like that. So yeah, we know like the critique of these more expert-based measures, but I would say we have pretty limited knowledge regarding the quality of the data from these citizen surveys. Like one reason is they are pretty new. Like most of them have like popped up in the last 10-15 years, so we haven't had like long time to study data quality here, at least compared to the other measures. And like research on survey quality in general, that's an old field. I mean, that like survey research in the modern sense has been around like at least in the 40s, 50s. So we know a lot about that there are many well-known problems in sort of normal public opinion surveys. But I don't think necessarily that these problems have been appreciated by the people, researchers running these citizen surveys. So what I do in this study is explore two specific sources of potential bias that could affect these citizen surveys on corruption. So political bias and sensitivity bias. And these are like well-known biases that we have encountered before in sort of normal, ordinary public opinion research, but I would argue at least haven't sufficiently explored these potential biases in the context of citizen surveys on corruption. So political bias is simply that people might respond in a political manner to different questions. So what does that mean? Well, we know from research on economic perceptions, for instance, that these measures tend to show strong political patterns. So if we take the US as an example, we will over and over again see that Democrats say that the economy is doing fine when there's a Democrat president, and Republicans will say the economy is doing fine when Donald Trump is president, and vice versa. So we have these really strong political patterns where people's perceptions really diverge based on their political affiliations. So it's basically political leanings color reality in this sense. Like even when we ask people factual questions, we get these like really strong diverging patterns. Really interesting recent example is, for instance, like the US election of 2020. Republicans say that the election was stolen, basically, and Democrats say it was basically a clean election, and this is like a factual question. So even when we have like real evidence and a strong like factual basis, people are strongly diverging based on their political affiliations. So we sometimes say that political affiliations work as sort of a perceptual screen in how people experience the world. And there are a number of explanations for why this might be the case. Some talk about like motivated reasoning, like rationalizing. When my guy is in office, like good things tend to happen, and when the guy I don't like is in office, bad things tend to happen, and I sort of rationalize my perceptions based on that. But there could also be other explanations based on like what type of benchmark you use, what you're looking for when you evaluate the economy. It might be that, for instance, Democrats look more to like inequality and things like that. Maybe Republicans look more toward growth and measures like that. So they might simply be using different benchmarks to answer the question like, how well is the economy doing? But what we know is that these diverging patterns based on political affiliations tend to be really strong. And I argue that we should basically expect the same thing when it comes to corruption measures, maybe especially when it comes to corruption measures. And I will return to that point later. So the other type of bias, also well known, is sensitivity bias. So some survey questions are sensitive, and it's easy to see why when we're asking about maybe drug abuse and things like that. But research shows that sensitivity bias pops up like everywhere when it comes to attitudes, when it comes to different sorts of behavior, even like voting. People claim they voted when we had proof they didn't, and things like that. So that would be the sort of other way around, like social desirability bias in that case, but that's the other side of the coin. So this tends to be present when we're dealing with taboo topics, or when some type of answer might be sort of socially unacceptable. Then people tend to give a more socially desirable answer. So they say, yes, I voted, because they know that this is the sort of socially acceptable answer. And why might this influence corruption measures? Well, for instance, when we're talking about experience-based measures, corruption is illegal in basically all parts of the world, basically in every country. So admitting that you paid a bribe, or even that you were asked to pay a bribe, is admitting that you were part of a illegal transaction. So people might not want to admit that. And also, we know that like people really dislike corruption, like even in countries where corruption is really high. This is data from Romania that has like huge severe corruption problems. Like even in Romania, people say like it's never justifiable to pay bribes. So there's a really strong social norms about regarding bribe payment. So that might be another reason why people might be hesitant in giving out that sort of information when you ask them. Okay, so in this study,
Mattias,
yes,
could I ask something regarding these two types of bias that you just discussed?
Yep.
And I have two questions about that. Please feel free either to comment on them right now, or maybe they are already integrated in different slides later on in your presentation.
Yep.
So one is I was wondering, how would you categorize both in general in terms of managing a survey bias as a field of study that is quite old, as you mentioned, but also specifically related to corruption, the issue of political culture, because corruption very much depends on this clear division, or at least interpretation of the separation between the public and the private, right? And one of the classic discussions, of course, about corruption and how it is interpreted in the global south and in developing countries is the fact that in many places, the political system may not have completely settled on this division between the public and the private, and potentially in places where, you know, traditional norms or informal social norms may affect this. So I was wondering how you would classify this in terms of bias. And the second point is about the interpretation of the meaning of words from the position of the citizen, right? Because of course a survey question is worded in a certain way, but not everyone might agree on the meaning of those words. And because corruption is both a flexible concept and a concept that has evolved, it continues to evolve, but it has evolved for a really long time. There was actually a very interesting paper of a number of years ago, kind of making the point that, for example, surveys in Mexico, right, where people did not interpret certain actions as being reflective of a bribe or bribery, right? Because they just didn't interpret it that way. So I wonder if you would also classify that as a form of bias or as something related to the construction or the design of the survey.
Yeah, no, those are really interesting questions. Like the research I've seen on this is that, sure, there definitely does exist like cross-cultural differences in like when it comes to like gift giving and things like that. It's more part of some cultures than others, for instance. But when it comes to corruption, like at least the more clear-cut cases, when like some public official is demanding extra money to perform like just their duty, the research I've seen on this is that that's kind of universal, that people think that that's a bribe and that's also not morally justifiable. So and also if you look how people judge those cases morally, like for instance from the World Value Survey, you see basically universal condemnation of bribery, for instance. So yes, I think there are differences between countries, but I don't think they are super large. And when it comes to the more like clear-cut cases, I think that's basically universally condemned. At least that's how I read that research. But I'm no expert on like cross-cultural differences, like how people interpret more like the edge cases and things like that. But I know, for instance, Bo Rothstein, he argues that cross-cultural differences are pretty minor, and it's not an important explanation why some countries are more corrupt than others. An important explanation is not that they think it's okay to be corrupt, or like it's okay to demand bribes and things like that. So yes, would we classify that as a bias? I mean, it depends. Ideally, the baseline should be like the same scenario, and a bias in this case would be people not reporting their true experience. So they think it's a bribe, but they don't report that they were asked to pay a bribe. So that would be my definition of bias here, that they don't reveal their true experience or true preference or true perception.
So you mean you would equate that to a form of self-censorship?
Yes, when it comes to sensitivity bias, it's definitely a form of censorship, preference, falsification, or whatever you want to call it. I think your first point about like how people interpret words like corruption or abuse of power, that's super important, and I will return to this point, because I think that's one of the major problems with these perception-based measures, that we simply don't know how people interpret words like that. So I will return to that point, and you can bring it up again later if there you still have questions about that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So this study, I fielded this in Romania in 2019 to around 3,000 respondents. I collaborated with a survey company who ran this and translated the survey for me, and ran it in Romania. And people answer this survey mostly online. So the company recruits people and they send out a link where people can answer the survey. So Romania is interesting, like, because corruption is a big problem in Romania. It's among the EU's worst performance when it comes to corruption. The CPI, Transparency International Index, they rank them 44 out of 100, and like higher numbers are better here. So Sweden is like 88, 90 somewhere. Japan, I think it's 75, 74, so somewhere around that. So much better than Romania. So corruption is a big problem, a salient issue in Romania, and that's why it's an interesting case here. So in this survey, I embedded 2 experiments to try to measure and test for these political biases. So the first experiment centered around a number of standard perception questions that people use in surveys, like in citizen surveys. So I asked 3 standard corruption questions and 1 economic or a question about the economy as a reference point, because as I said before, we have a lot of evidence that people respond in a political manner when it comes to these economic questions, and I basically want to compare this to the corruption questions because my argument is that they should work basically the same. So the first interesting comparison here is how people supporting the government or opposing the government respond to these questions. So I basically expect people who support the government to be much more positive when it comes to corruption, and the other way around, like the opposition to be much more negative. But if it's the case that like political responding is an important explanation for this, then if we make political identities more salient, we should see even stronger patterns. That's my argument here, but because these diverging patterns could emerge from simply the fact that people, maybe they first experienced that corruption is high, and that's why they voted for the opposition. So that would be sort of a rational explanation for this. But if it's the case that it's has more to do with like political cheerleading, motivated reasoning, then if we simply made political identities stronger, then we should see even stronger diverging patterns. So I try to do this by experimentally changing the order of the question. So for some respondents, they answered questions about their political affiliation before the corruption question. So basically, like, do you support the government, or do you support the opposition, and questions like that. And when you ask those questions before that, and previous research has shown this, that makes people's political identities even stronger. So in that case, I expect even stronger diverging patterns if this hypothesis is true. So again, I make political identities more salient by randomly changing the question orders for some respondents. Testing for sensitivity bias is maybe less straightforward. So I test this by asking a standard bribe question that's used almost everywhere in all these citizen surveys. And that's like, in the past 12 years, did someone ask you to pay a bribe? So standard question. And my idea here is that if we find a way to really minimize sensitivity bias, and if that changes the result when we compare to the direct question, when we just ask people, that would be evidence that sensitivity bias is important when people ask this question. So what I do is conduct a so-called list experiment. And the basic idea here is, like, if people don't have to tell you directly about the sensitive behavior, they are more likely to tell you sort of indirectly when they don't have to reveal that information directly to you. So, like, in general, people want to give you like correct information, and they don't want to lie. So if you make it easy for them, and if they don't have to tell you directly, then they are more likely to give you that information. So the idea here is, instead of asking people directly this question, you list a number of things. So in this case, these 4 things here that are not sensitive or just normal things, and you ask, like, how many things out of this list did you do or did happen to you the past year? So you give that to the control group, and then you have a treatment group that you pick randomly, and you add 1 item to the list, and that's the sensitive item. So in this case, it's being asked to pay a bribe by a public official. So no one has to disclose directly that they actually paid a bribe. They just have to say, okay, 2 things out of this list happened to me, or I did 2 of these things, or 3 things. And then you just compare the treatment group to the control group. And the only difference between the treatment group and control group is the sensitive item. So you, on the group level, you get an estimate of how like the agreement with this sensitive item, but no one has to disclose that to you directly. So, but you still can compare the groups and get an estimate, like how likely are people to agree with this item. So here you get an estimate where no one has to disclose that information to you directly, and that should really decrease sensitivity bias. So what I do here, I compare the estimate I get from this experiment to the estimate I get from a direct question, just asking people. So what do I find here? So in terms of political bias, this is the first experiment with the standard corruption questions that I talked about a minute ago here. So we do find these really strong diverging patterns between, depending on whether or not you support the government or not. So if we take this first question, like, high numbers mean that you perceive that corruption increased over the past year. And if we look at the opposition, that's others here, control group, like, they're almost at the max level here, like 5 is max. So they say, yes, corruption definitely increased over the past year. If we look at government supporters, they are much lower, like 1 whole scale step lower, and that's quite a lot when you're looking at like scale like this. So they are much more positive when it comes to recent development in terms of corruption. And if we look at this group where they were asked about their political identity before the corruption questions, we see even lower numbers. So they adjust their response even lower when their political identities were made salient to them before we asked the corruption questions. So that suggests that this political responding, partisan responding is prevalent when it comes to these questions. And we find like the same pattern when we ask about corruption in politics, or when we ask like how worried they are about corruption in general. And we also sort of replicate previous findings about the economy here. So we see that these corruption perception measures seem to work in the same way as the economy measures. So basically, this tells me that political bias seems to be strong when it comes to corruption measures.
Mattias, can I ask something about those results? That's very interesting. I'm also seeing, so if I'm reading this correctly, there appears to be a lot more consensus in the spread of responses for those that are not supporters of the government, right? Because
Yes.
it seems that the distribution of the responses is a lot more clustered compared to government supporters. Do you have any preliminary explanation for this, or an informed guess?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, they're basically saying like they're super negative on all measures. Like corruption is increasing, corruption is a big problem, corruption is prevalent in politics. So they're basically really negative on all measures. I don't know. It's hard to say why exactly that would be the case. Like one interpretation is that is really their true perception, that like corruption is a really big problem in Romania, and we had like many recent corruption scandals and all that. So maybe they're just like reporting their sort of true perception, and the other ones are to different degrees adjusting their perception based on their political identity. So that would be my that would be one interpretation, because we also see, and I'm actually not reporting that in this graph, I think it's in the appendix on the paper, the opposition supporters do not change that much when you give them, like when you ask them about their political identity before the corruption questions. It's rather the government supporters that change a lot when you sort of turn the question order around. And that's also suggesting that it's the government supporters who really adjust their answers and not the opposition supporters. So maybe like when you're in the opposition, you're not like invested in the government, like protecting the government in that sense. It's sort of more vague what you're protecting when you're in the opposition, and so maybe they are simply reporting their true perception, would be one interpretation. But that's a really interesting question, I think.
A follow-up to that question, and it's very short because I also want to give the mic to Maria Fernanda. Would you also expect difference in the way that these results appear here based on the way that the question about government support has been operationalized between, for example, a dichotomous question for a person to say yes or no, compared to also find themselves within a spectrum using a Likert scale, from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. Would you also expect that to have an impact in these results, for example?
I think so, actually, but because these questions that I asked are sort of standard dry questions, like how did you vote in the last election? Like, do you support the current government? You could imagine questions that are more so that sort of make their social identities even more so. Like there are question batteries, like asking specifically, like, do you get upset if someone like criticizes your favorite party, and like more tailored toward the social identity aspects of politics. So, and in that case, I would probably expect even stronger results. So maybe this could be interpreted as a sort of lower conservative estimate in that sense, because the questions are like not very like politically charged in that case. It's just normal questions about like political preferences.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maria Fernanda, would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you. Actually, we're also conducting this type of surveys in Brazil, so we're very interested in the results that you find in here. And thanks for this type of experiment. It's really interesting. And I'm curious about this political bias, and also like knowing about the framing on the main questions of the questionnaire, right? Where you asked to pay a bribe, for example, right, in terms of experience, or even in terms of expectations, like what do you think of corruption in a specific political service, for example? For this type of questions, did you also find some political bias or not? Or were they just framed to more generic questions?
Yes, political bias specifically is for the perception questions here. So it's a question like, do you perceive that corruption has increased over the past year and things like that? So the bribe question is what I call an experience-based question. And I will return to this later, but I expect political bias to be not as strong when it comes to experience-based questions if we can manage the sensitivity bias problem. Because and I will talk more about this later, but they are much more specific. So you have much less room for interpretation when you ask about like bribe payment and things like that. So I definitely expect, and I also find that political bias is by far strongest when it comes to these perception-based questions where we have like a lot of room for interpretation in the way the question is framed.
Thank you.
All right, to sum up the results on political bias here, we find these really strong patterns where government supporters are way more positive with regard to corruption compared to opposition supporters. And we also find that this gap increases substantially when we give them this political prime, like where we ask them about their political preference before corruption, the corruption questions. And this is suggesting to me that we have strong evidence of political responding in this sense, that people are sort of adjusting their perceptions based on their political affiliations. What about sensitivity bias? So the left-hand estimate here, that's what you get when you ask them the direct question. Like respondents in Romania, you ask them, like, did someone ask you to pay a bribe during the past 12 months? And you have almost, I think it's 18 or 19% saying, yes, someone asked me to pay a bribe. When we instead ask them with this special question format, the list experiment, where they don't have to tell you directly, but you can still, like on the aggregate level, estimate the rate of agreement with the sensitive item, we get like a much higher estimate. So this is 36% or something like that. So it jumps from, it's almost twice as high, like it jumps from 19% with the direct questions to like 36% when they are allowed to respond in this indirect way where they don't have to tell you directly. So that is suggesting that people underreport their corruption experiences. And we can't, of course, tell like exactly why they wouldn't tell you like the truth in this case. But again, like corruption, it's illegal. Like being part of a corrupt transaction is an illegal activity, even if it's if someone demands that of you. So there are many reasons for why this pattern might emerge. A different interesting finding is that we can look at subgroups here, and we see that these measures are, or these estimates are quite noisy. We get like really wide confidence intervals. That's a consequence of this special question format, the list experiment. You get more uncertainty. So the results that I'm most confident in here are these like middle results when we compare male and female respondents. So the gray estimates, that's the direct question. When we ask like women directly, do you have to pay a bribe? And we ask men directly, do you have to pay a bribe? We see that men respond to a higher extent than women that they had to pay a bribe in the past 12 months. But when we use this indirect measure, we get the opposite pattern, that women are more likely to say that they were asked to pay a bribe than men. And that's interesting because the previous literature, there are many papers trying to explain, okay, why is it that women are asked, aren't asked as much as men to pay bribes? Why is this the case? And there are theories why, like maybe they are poorer, maybe they're more like at home and things like that. So theories trying to explain that pattern that we see with the gray estimates here. But I actually find that the true pattern might be the opposite. So maybe like it's the case that women are actually more asked to pay bribes than men. And why might that be the case? Like one theory, I mean, I can only speculate, that one theory might be that women are more in contact with some institutions where bribe payment is really rampant, at, for instance, the healthcare sector, for instance. That would be one explanation for why women actually are more likely to be asked to pay bribe than men, if these results are true.
Philip?
Thank you. And maybe you say, thank you, Mattias. You probably just answered my question, which was, I mean, it is the question of the, what sort of bribes, only talking about bribes here, rather than asking people, do you feel that some form of corruption has affected you? For example, conflict of interest stopped me getting the job I wanted, or something like that. So yes, I think it very much, as we're doing the bribery as the example here, it would depend on what was their life setting. If health sector, if it's free of charge at the point of delivery and there's no access charges, then of course you'll get less. It's whether in the household, who's doing most of the interactions with officials, I guess. But no, thank you very much.
I think that's the most likely explanation, that they like women are more likely to interact with these institutions where bribery is common. And again, like you said in your question, that if we would have phrased this slightly differently, like and also covered things like nepotism, and we might get different results, definitely. So this question is specific in that case. We're asking about bribery specifically. So yeah, that's I will discuss this a bit later, but it really matters how we phrase these questions. But for this specific question, at least in my data, I actually find the opposite pattern, and that's interesting in relation to previous research, I think.
Before you move on, I also wanted to mention something, and because I think that that result of the effect of gender is quite telling, because if I understand it correctly, it further supports your interpretation of sensitivity bias, right? Because it will suggest that indeed the way that, especially as you mentioned, if people consider that there's any risk to themselves in being in answering a survey honest, it seems that potentially this is what we're seeing as well, right? Yes. That men would perceive themselves a lot less vulnerable to being affected by being honest compared to women. So this is great. Could you also say something about that result concerning government supporter, because it also followed the same structure, right? In terms of government supporter having being a lot more affected by bias, apparently. Could you say something about this?
Definitely. I mean, first, I completely agree. Like, this is suggesting that women are more affected by sensitivity bias, and I also think my go-to interpretation would be that they are more vulnerable, they have more to lose here, so that's why they are more affected, but more cautious in how they respond. So the estimates to the left here, I didn't talk about these. And one reason is that they are quite uncertain. We have really high confidence intervals, so I don't want to overinterpret this. But what they show is that this suggests that government supporters actually are really affected by sensitivity bias. And that makes sense if we connect that to the political bias. So when we ask government supporters directly, they say like to really low rate that they were asked to pay bribe. But when we ask them indirectly, that estimate is way higher. So maybe this is because they want to like protect their sort of current government that they support, and the current sort of system that the government is responsible for how things turn out in society. So if I want to protect the government, I simply don't say that I was asked to pay bribe, but when they are allowed to disclose this information indirectly, the estimate is way higher. So this would be in line with the political bias results, I would say. But again, I don't want to overinterpret these results because the uncertainty is still really high. But if we take the results as face value, that's what they show. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So to sum up on the sensitivity bias here, basically these results suggest that direct questions about corruption experiences are sensitive, and as a consequence, they are likely to be underreported. And I think again that these subgroup differences are really interesting, because it would be less of a problem if the underreporting was sort of the same across all subgroups, because then you could still at least compare subgroups when it comes to the direct questions. But this suggests that we might have like large differences also in subgroups when it comes to sensitivity bias. So that makes this problematic, at least for the direct questions. Some implications of these results, if we return to these perception measures that I connect to political bias. I think the problem with these measures, and again, these are the perceptions measures where we, for instance, ask like, do you perceive that corruption has increased over the past year, or how common do you perceive it is that politicians are involved in corruption, for instance. So I think the main problem with these measures is that they are vague, like the questions are vague and they are open for interpretation. So another example here is like the Eurobarometer, the EU, European Commission, they collect a lot of like really great data from the European Union, and they like from time to time they run these surveys where they ask about corruption in the European Union specifically. So this is from what I think is the most recent one, Eurobarometer 523. And so this is a perception question in that survey. So they ask, do you think that giving and taking bribes and the abuse of power of personal gain are widespread among any of the following? And then they ask about like a bunch of different institutions. So one interesting result here is that like over 40% in Sweden say that like bribes, abuse of power is widespread among politicians in Sweden. And to be honest, this is really implausible. Like to me, like we haven't had like any big corruption scandals in Sweden like recently. There definitely is corruption in Sweden. I'm not saying that, but like 40% say that it's widespread among politicians. Yeah, that sounds really implausible to me. And it's the same with like Finland, one of the cleanest countries in the world. They also say like corruption is widespread among politicians, and we sort of have the same results with political parties. So do we have a question here again?
Yeah, Camille?
Yep, please.
Sorry, thank you for this insightful presentation. It's not just a question, but perhaps a comment. I don't think that the problem lies in the nature of question, which are vague. Sometimes the specialists in surveys, they ask vague questions just to circumvent the desirability, because if they ask direct question, they will be faced with the desirability issues and the political desirability and so on. So that the problem is more in the nature of perception. Perception, and this is from my experience, is no longer a reliable source to upon which you can build political strategies, because there are a lot of things, a lot of variables that can distort the results of the surveys based on perception. You have what we call the Trocadero paradox. That means the more you talk about corruption, the more the perception of corruption will be. So you have also the instrumentalization of corruption. Corruption is, I make a study recently about, and I gathered the data about corruption in my countries for 20 years, data which are provided by 14 indicators and sub-indicators, Transparency International, Variety of Democracy indicators, the World Justice Project indicator, which has 4 sub-indicators that measure corruption, the World Governance Indicator of the World Bank. And I wanted, and I make a correlation test based on the Pearson methodology. But I found that out of 72 correlation indices, I found that only 8 indices show that there is a correlation, a strong correlation between the results of different measurements. Which this mean? And I did this when I was in government. I was a minister, and I had to build the strategy, and I need the data. What I found that the data shows different results. When the measurement shows that corruption has increased, the other measurement for the same year shows that corruption has decreased. So you cannot trust them to build your strategy. And for this reason, now the trend is towards homegrown indicators, which are the indicators are developed locally to serve the local purpose, because global indices, they are good indicators for advocacy, for the use by media, to put pressure on government. But when it comes to building a strategy on anti-corruption, you cannot use these indicators and these results. Thank you.
I also would like to direct participants to the comments provided by Salome Flores in the chat, who is from the UNODC, and she was leading the group that was working and just delivered the framework, UNODC framework for measuring corruption, in partnership with the statistical offices of the participating countries. So I think that connects very well with the comment by Kamal. We have a question also by Aram Santiago, and then Susanna also in the chat. Aram, please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. And when talking about sensitivity and comparing, let's say, data from Sweden, Finland, and going to other countries, sometimes when working with people or doing surveys, as surprising as it may sound, people ask, but what is corruption? And or is it bribery, or corruption is something else? So I think in some cases, when people respond to how much corruption do they perceive, depending on the country, it might be, okay, corruption is mainly or predominantly about bribery, and there is a lot happening in this country, also in the in different sectors. But let's say in other countries where there is no much bribery, taking into account also the Nordic countries, people might think about nepotism, patronage, and at the end, although the extent of corruption and the amount of corrupt transactions are not equal at all to each other, but based on perception measurements, the figures can be not that distinguishable from each other.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Santiago?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this very, very interesting presentation. I'm Santiago Wardman-Joffre. I'm a junior policy analyst at the OECD. I'm working in the public sector integrity division on the public integrity indicators. I believe Jesper Johnson was here in the previous session of the roundtable. And I find it quite fascinating, because it's true in our work. What we try to do is address this gap between real corruption and perception, in a way, by providing these indicators with using primary data with governments, but mainly focusing on the safeguards, right? So regulatory safeguards and practical safeguards. I think perhaps a lot of what Mattias showed here with Finland and Sweden can also be perhaps explained through these safeguards, right? I don't know if you explored the correlation between regulatory and practical safeguards and perception as well. So as to see how these setups, government setups, can affect this perception as well, beyond political views and beyond expert surveys.
Yes, that's not something that I have explored specifically, but it would definitely be really interesting, I think. Yeah, definitely.
Zuzana?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation and a great topic. I'll definitely take a look at your paper. I have one question and two comments. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm from the OECD, from the economics department of the OECD. My question is on this example of Eurobarometer and the Finland and Sweden sort of data that you showed us. I mean, if I understood correctly, you're saying that the political bias that relates to the perception questions would tend to underestimate those perceptions. And so I was wondering whether and how does it relate to the current government, in practice, whether you could sort of make any comments on that. And if I understand correctly, you're saying that basically what Eurobarometer is showing is not realistic. You don't believe that this indicator makes sense for those countries. And my two comments are on the citizen surveys. I mean, I looked at a couple of years back, I looked at some of these citizen surveys, and the issue for if you're trying to do some cross-country work there is that the questions are not exactly the same. Yeah. And that complicates in terms of doing some research when you're trying to make sure that you use even if you put these surveys together, it is difficult to find the same question or at least enough overlap to build a cross-country variable that you could use in cross-country work. And the second comment I have is Okay, so we have these biases there, and they are important, as your paper shows on Romania. But I would just like to say that, you know, we deal with biases in other indicators as well. I mean, I've worked on income inequality data, and there we know that the very rich and the very poor are not necessarily well reported. And yet we still use this data for quite a lot of our analytical work, and, you know, making conclusions and giving policy recommendations based on that. So when I'm trying to find, you know, sort of a good representation of the corruption in countries, I think it's important to combine probably the expert indices with the citizen experiences to give a better, more balanced picture. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Many good comments here. Try to respond to some of them, and you can, if I'm not responding to your question, you can ask them again later. First, I just want to say, like, this example with Finland and Sweden was just to illustrate that basically we don't know how people interpret these questions. And in this case, I'm pretty confident that people are not thinking about like corruption in a narrow sense, like the Transparency International's like definition of corruption. Like even though they sort of threw this abuse of power for private gain into the question, like people interpret that, like they can interpret that in any way. That could be like, okay, I don't like that politicians are lowering taxes, for instance. Yeah, that's definitely abusing power for private gain because they gain from low taxes or something like that. So if we're looking for corruption in a narrow sense, then I don't think this is a plausible estimates that people really like 40% of people in Sweden think that Swedish politicians are corrupt in a sort of more narrow sense. But I simply think they are thinking about something else. And that's the problem with like the question being vague, because I don't think respondents know exactly what we are asking for here with a question like this. Like, sure, like taking bribes, they might sort of know what we mean by that. But then we have this abuse of power for personal gain. That could mean like anything. So I think basically people here in the Eurobarometer, they're just saying, yeah, I don't really like politicians. That's what they're saying when answering this question. Basically, and this is related to the previous comment about like these perception measures. Yes, I definitely think they can be useful, but I think it was Kamel, I think, said that they should be adapted to more like local circumstances, and we should primarily think like, what is it that we're trying to measure here? Like we sometimes talk about like construct validity, measurement validity. Like, what is the concept or construct that we are trying to capture with these measures? Like, if it's like how people use the word corruption in day-to-day life, for instance, yeah, I think they are capturing something like that. Like people say, yeah, politicians in Sweden, they are definitely corrupt because they do this policy that I don't like. But if we want to capture something more specific, then I think that has to be reflected in the questions. Like, they have to be much less vague, more specific, and tailored to a specific purpose. Because now I think there's sort of this catch-all. We're trying to just like catch everything with this, like how do you perceive like corruption in society? But I think that's way too broad, and that leaves so much room for people to interpret this in any way they want. So we can't in turn interpret the answers. And I also think in general we should avoid like loaded terms. Like we know people have a lot of connotations when it comes to corruption, like someone being corrupt, the political establishment is corrupt. Like I don't think we have to use terms like that to capture the thing we're interested in here. And also like abuse of power, like terms like that. I think people they draw a lot of inferences, and they relate those terms to many different things. So I think we should try first to think like, what is it exactly that we're trying to capture here? And that will be depending on like why we run this survey in the first place. Like, is it for like local election campaign, or is it like to map corruption in politics? Like, the answer to that will be different, but we should really think about that. Like, what is the construct we're trying to capture? And then we should try to tailor the questions to that specific purpose. And just to mention, like, one really good guide or paper covering this is from Stancheva from Harvard, and I have the complete reference at the end of my talk. That's a really good like general guide about like constructing informative survey questions in general that I think people should follow more, especially when it comes to these perception-based measures. And one final point, I think this speaks strongly against using these surveys to test like political theories, like does corruption perceptions influence vote choice, for instance? So if we use a single survey for that, we will have like reversed causality, like corruption perceptions might influence vote choice, but vote choice, like political identity, might also influence corruption perceptions, and that's sort of impossible to deal with in any convincing way. So we should be very cautious in using these surveys to test political theories, I think. When it comes to these corruption experiences, these experience-based measures like the bribery measures, I think they are quite good in terms of design, because I think they tend to be quite specific and not very ambiguous, like in what they are asking for. So a good example from the Eurobarometer is this question that sort of is a more detailed bribery question. So they first asked, like, have you been in contact with, for instance, a healthcare provider, a practitioner? And then, like, during this contact, were you asked to give extra payment, a valuable gift to a nurse, or make a donation to the hospital? So I think this question avoids like loaded terms. They don't even mention like bribery. They don't mention corruption, abuse, or anything like that. But it's sort of a factual question, like just report your experience here. So I think this is a good example of a question that's hard to misunderstand. And like we talked about before, questions like these, combining these questions with like expert assessments, I think that's a really good way to improve on these expert-based measures, because here we have like potentially a really good measure of petty bribery, sort of bribery on the ground. However, I still think we need to deal with this sensitivity bias problem, because that might also be prevalent in a question like this. I think this question is phrased in a way that should minimize sensitivity bias, because again, we don't have these loaded terms. And also, if you ask these questions in an online setting rather than like via the phone or face-to-face, like the online setting is also known to minimize sensitivity bias. So yeah, I think these questions definitely are very useful. And if we want to minimize sensitivity bias even more, we could use these sort of list experiments that I used in my study, or there are a bunch of other methods to minimize sensitivity bias. The so-called crosswise model is a sort of question format that I use in another study in Mexico, and I have the reference at the end of my talk if you want to check that out. So that's a different way of minimizing sensitivity bias that you could use. So the cost of these methods is that you increase uncertainty. So you always have to think of that trade-off, like we will need a large sample to get precise estimates when we use techniques like the list experiment or crosswise model. You might need like 2,000-3,000 respondents, basically. So sometimes you basically have to settle for the direct questions because you don't get a sample size that's sufficiently large to use these methods. But when we have large sample sizes, we should at least consider it if this would be good in a specific case. Okay, to wrap up, maybe I have sounded like pretty negative about citizen service here, but this is just like pointing out specific problems that I think need our attention. In general, I think citizen service are a very valuable source of data that I used tons of times in my own research. So basically, we should just be careful when we use them. We should think about these potential biases and how they might influence a specific result, or how we try to use the survey in a specific case. And again, I think it's important that we evaluate data quality in relation to some specific goals, and especially when it comes to perception-based measures. We should think more about like, what is it that we're trying to capture here, and do we capture that specific thing with these measures? I think that could help us guide practice when it comes to perception-based measures. And I mean, again, the bottom line and why we have these roundtables is that, yeah, measuring corruption is really, really tricky, and we can't get around that problem, but we can still work to improve our methods. And I think citizen service is one area where we could be more careful about the methods we use. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mattias. That was wonderful. I kept some questions still on my head, and but unfortunately I know that we have run out of time. But you know, there's always the opportunity for a follow-up discussion at some point, because this is a fascinating discussion. It was a great presentation, and especially at the end, the conclusions and the remarks that suggest that there's still a lot of work ahead of us as we continue expanding also the type of indicators, many of which will need to be populated using survey questions. And so the issue of how to word them, how to build them, and what type of controls to include in those surveys, it will only be more and more significant as we move towards that target. So thank you very much again for a wonderful presentation. Thank you everyone for joining today. We will be sharing with all of you the meeting report, that will be prepared by Ms. Rezi Barath. We will probably have that ready to share with you in a few weeks. And in around a month's time, we will also be sharing online the full video of today's meeting. So look forward to that as well. And yeah, I hope I see all of you in for our next roundtable in October, and I will be making the announcement of those details in a few weeks as well. Well, thank you everyone. Have a lovely morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mattias.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you very much.